Hi, it's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. So happy that you are tuning in for another podcast. Love the opportunity to share information with you, especially as it relates to our children, and really help people understand that there are so many ways for us to identify the progress that our child is making. You know, most of the time, we limit it to the school performance. And if things aren't going just exactly right in school, sometimes it's laid out as a behavior when most of the time it's really about their development. And I've had some really interesting conversations lately. And I think that it would just be an ideal healthcare system if we could really help parents know that there is individuals like me out there that really focus on development and break it down, pull it apart, and figure out where a child has left off, and then help navigate the path to get things back on track. Think about all the different situations that could go on, like a brain injury. Whether it's traumatic or perhaps something even organic. Let's think about a stroke, a heart attack, and the rehabilitation that people will go through in order to get their lives back on track. So if we can do that in situations like that, what more would it be to think of if somebody's development is just off track? Either it's a small piece of the track or a big piece of the track. That's just going to define the effort and how much has to be done. But why wouldn't we be able to get the development back on track? So we've been doing many cases over the last couple of months, and I'm going to kind of wrap that one up, this series up today. And then next month, I'm going to move into specifically the primitive reflexes. I've talked about the primitive reflexes in almost every single podcast. And the reason is that it is one of the greatest signposts that we can see. It's normal, it's expected, it should integrate. And when it doesn't, it causes problems for the individual. I can remember back when my mom had a stroke, and it was back in around 2005, maybe 4. And I can remember how it impacted the left side of her body. So the idea would be that she had a stroke on the right and it impacted the left physical part. Lots of times people think that it's just what they can see, but it's really the entire side of the body, all the way down. It's the eye, it's the ear, it's the nose, the mouth, swallowing, the lung, digestion. The left side of the body would be the descending colon, and then, of course, the arm and leg. But specifically as it relates to primitive reflexes, I remember working on her body one day for her. And I literally, when it was going all the way down, trying to open up that hand on the left-hand side. And as soon as my hand pressed into the palm of her hand, literally her fingers closed. The palmar reflex. The same reflex that we want to see in newborns, as soon as you place your finger into the fleshy part of the palm, the baby's hands will close. It's a signpost that says neurology is working. So what happened for her, now that reflex came back, because reflexes are the rudimentary place of all learning, but now it would be thought of as a pathological reflex. So I think of it like a continuum, almost like a bell curve. It's expected on the front end, and then there's a season of time we shouldn't have it there unless something at some point in our life causes some kind of incredible brain trauma that literally could bring these reflexes back on. They're so powerful. And doing assessments on children, there really hasn't been an assessment in 27 years that I haven't found some reflex always present. Most of the time, I am always finding the withdrawal reflexes, the Moro reflex, and then asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. All of these we're going to get into and really pull them apart starting next month because they're very, very powerful indicators. And I'm going to match them up to what you would see in your child, especially as your child is school age. So when we think about adults, and if they had a problem, we would be asking them, how is this affecting your daily activities, your work, etc.? But a child, they go to school. And so what is life like for that child to go to school? And so many kids really are having a very difficult time. And the interesting part to me is that most of them, you don't see anything. You don't see some kind of injury. These are all invisible problems. Unfortunately, I think most of the time they actually get funneled into that this child's behavior is not appropriate. And over the years, I have been astounded as to how many kids have been kicked out of school. So there's a lot going on for our kids. Many things have to do with their development. Many things also are about things that go on in their life, and they just don't know how to regulate with it. And that too can have many different origins of existence. So when we're talking about kids, especially under the age of 8, what has that first 8 years been like? And I would also include the pregnancy in that equation. So it would really be like 9 years. How was the pregnancy? Was mom relaxed? Was this a planned pregnancy? Did everything go as expected? What was the labor and delivery part? And then we dive in specifically to the child. What went on for the child? Did the child have a hard time? Did something happen in that child's early years? Were there a bunch of ear infections? Was there strep? Was there a colic when the baby was an infant? I mean, so many of these things we now know play a huge part in how the neuroimmune interface is actually going to develop. Lots of times things do boil down with stress for children. So today I'm actually going to show you a picture of how we get a stress response evaluation. And we do this not only on children, but we also do it on adults. This gives us an indicator as to how the system is actually working. I started utilizing this particular program back in 2008. And so for my podcast audience, I'm really going to encourage you. Listen, I'm going to make sure I give good details so that you can see it in your mind's eye. But I also would like you to go back and actually look at the picture. We are finally getting some of these issues that we've had with YouTube straightened out, the phone number straightened out. So I'll tie it all up with a bow before we get done. But we have now decided to keep the Connect My Brain YouTube channel, but now start the Dr. Laura Hanson YouTube channel. And that's where we're going to put all the different videos that are associated with the podcast. So I'd love for you to go and subscribe to both, not only to the podcast, but also to the YouTube channel. But you're going to be able to see these pictures, go back and look at it and listen to it again. Because lots of times I will ask people, do you feel stressed? And lots of times you get this, well, no, and especially kids. They really don't have a point of reference to know what does stress really feel like. Now, as I was saying, I started using this particular piece of equipment in 2008 because I really wanted some type of a tool to measure the Moro reflex. And the reason I wanted to measure it is because the Moro reflex activates three things in the neurology. Arousal, does the baby wake up? The rhythm of the sleep-wake cycle, which will grow up to first, the baby knowing that someone's going to pay attention to them. Then, as the baby goes into being a toddler, learning how to pay attention to self, like with potty training. And then the ability to pay attention to others. So all these kids that are getting labeled attention deficit, I would tell you, if it's not 100%, it's at least 98% of those children also have a very heightened stress response. So the second thing that Moro activates is the balance between CO2 and O2, so oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then the third thing is the sympathetic nervous system. Every time we use those words, fight or flight, that is what you are talking about. You are talking about the sympathetic nervous system, which is under the autonomic nervous system of the human body. And autonomic means that it is automatic. It is not something that you sit there and tell yourself to do. It's a response mechanism. So it is built based on what goes on in early years, but also in people's lives where maybe they're struggling with stress. Maybe there are some fears. I read in my intake forms how many moms were afraid of childbirth. Today, there's a lot of people that are afraid to have children. We've gone through this situation with the China virus that has literally put an enormous amount, it has put an enormous amount of fear into people. To even this day, December 17th, 2022, people are still walking around with masks on. We are literally a feedback mechanism. If we believe that we are in danger, you are triggering that response. And it can go on and perpetuate to where it literally is who your brain thinks you are. And then over time, this was another reason to start measuring this, because if there is a chronic stress pattern, it is going to take over real estate in the brain. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, for example, I was a tennis player when I was in high school. I was pretty good too. And I'd love to get back out there and play. I love tennis. So if I lived in a chronic stress pattern, and let's break that down even more. I'm going to use it. I'm going to give an example like using your heater. So let's say you set your thermostat at 65 degrees and for your heat. So every time it drops below 65, your heater should kick on, raise the temperature, and then it should shut off. But if something was wrong with your heater and it never shut off, can't we all agree that eventually it's going to cause that heater maybe to burn out, or something's going to happen and a repair is going to be warranted? So the same thing is true with our body. If we constantly are in a stress response, we are going to create a feed-forward pathway that's going to perpetuate that response, kind of like a hamster in a wheel. And you got to get off, because there are so many biological changes that go on when we are in a stress response. One of the very first things is how all the blood gets shunted differently, meaning that it gets diverted because the brain thinks there's a threat and you may have to run or fight. So blood shifts away from your whole intestinal system, where digestion is, where your reproductive hormones are, or reproductive organs are, your elimination organs, your adrenals. And it literally shunts the blood out to your arms and legs, preparing you to either fight or run. Now, up in your brain, it shifts it from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, which would drive those big arms and legs to be able to do whatever they feel like they need to do. Now, imagine if this was going on all the time. Let's bring pain into the equation for a second. So there's a lot of people that live with chronic pain. And every year that you have chronic pain, you're actually losing 1.25 cubic centimeters of gray matter in your brain, and that's where you process information. And eventually, chronic pain is literally taking over the real estate. What happens to people living in chronic pain, their range of motion is incredibly limited. They're not very happy. Well, and I don't blame them. If I was in chronic pain, I wouldn't be happy either. But this is what I mean by taking over real estate. But here's the other feed-forward mechanism. You only need 10% of what we call a nociceptor, which is a pain receptor. All you need is 10% of that to fire up to the thalamus of the brain, which creates a relay all over the brain to register, I'm in pain. The other 90% feeds back into the autonomic nervous system, and whammo, there you go again, another stress response. So this can come from so many avenues. Maybe your diet is horrible. Well, that's going to trigger an inflammatory cascade that even chemistry can start to trigger the autonomic nervous system to engage in a sympathetic response. So this is what I mean by taking over real estate in your brain. So back to the example of being a tennis player. So let's say I had all these marvelous connections up in my brain in order to play tennis. All of the precision of eye movements and arm coordination and power to hit the ball and move my arms and legs in different directions, different speeds. If I'm not using those motor pathways, well, and the brain's going, you obviously want to stay in this chronic stress pattern, then it'll say you're not using your tennis skills. So I'm going to take that space. And I'm going to perpetuate this chronic stress pattern. Okay, that's a big deal. Now imagine if you're a child. Imagine that you are an open window of development and your feedback into your neurology is stress. You are literally wiring up your system based on the perception of stress. Now, we touched on what it does to the gut, what it does to the brain, what it does to the body. Take those pieces and put them into the child. How many of these kids that have different situations going on, and I'm just going to put this little canopy of developmental delay. I don't mean to bring it about as a label, but just for simplicity in a conversation. Development did not go as expected. All of them have gut issues. All of them have brain issues. All of them, what I said was, if not 100%, 98% of them have the same pattern that you're looking at right now. So for my podcast audience, I have a stress response evaluation report on my screen. And the very first page of this particular report, what it does is it gives this big global picture of red bars and green bars. And at the top, it's got the words heart rate, temperature, respiration, skin conduction, which is the moisture. Like a lot of people may sweat when they get stressed out, and then muscle tone. So one of the first things that you do when you feel stress is you actually elevate your shoulders in preparation for fight or run to protect the neck. This is why so many people walk around going, it's just my traps. My traps hurt so much all the time. Well, if we did a stress response test on you, would it be interesting to see what that muscle tone actually looks like? So this is a global picture. Underneath each of those categories, there's an S and an R. And the S stands for what the body was doing during the stress, and then what the body was doing during recovery. So an individual goes through 4 stressors when they take this test. And then they close their eyes for the recovery phase. So this particular individual, what you see is under heart rate, they are heart rate and temperature. They are at least 4 standard deviations away from what is expected. And this is a child. So the heart rate, maybe that's what plays a part with why this particular child had terrible endurance when they first started. But it's also an indication of some stress. So most of the time, it really is about what that child is perceiving in their world that's bringing about the stress. There's always the possibility of something going on at home, something going on at school, but for the most part, it's how the child really is trying to navigate their world. And what I have found is children from about 2nd grade to about their 2nd year in college, they are always sizing themselves up with their peers. Now, this particular child really had some cognitive struggles with reading, comprehension, and even communication. So I can imagine when I'm in an environment where everybody else seems to kind of be navigating their world, that I might feel a little bit more stressed. But again, as I've said in other podcasts, children don't have a point of reference. So they don't know to go up to a parent and say, or even a teacher and say, hey, I notice all my peers really move through the work easily, but I don't. So I think this is really having an impact on my body. Could you imagine a child actually saying something like that? Of course not. They don't have that ability yet. So this is why doing a developmental assessment is so powerful, because we can really help be the voice of the child. Wow, that just made my heart dance. Being the voice of the child brings clarity, allows that child to actually have the moment of being understood, and never to take away from parents. You know your child better than anybody, but you're also the parent. And you know, kids do so much better, especially in like this kind of a workout situation, with their parent being somewhere else and allowing them to just kind of move through the process. And it's safe and it's free, and they see other kids doing it. So it's okay if you mess up. You don't have to feel any judgment. So as we continue to look at this, respiration is still in the green, but it is headed towards 1 standard deviation away from what is expected. Skin conduction during the stress response was over 1 standard deviation away. The recovery, it actually lightened up. But then we've got left muscle tone, both during the stress and during the recovery, beyond 2 standard deviations. And then the right kind of looks like the skin conduction. The stress response made the red bar go just below the -1, so 1 standard deviation away. But the recovery, it turned into green, below 0. So there's an asymmetry in how this child is responding. And that's really important, especially as we look at the structure of the body, because the left side would indicate the left cerebellum and the right side of the brain. And the right side of the brain is more of the emotional quotient, which literally matched for this child. So when I look at these reports, I take many pieces into my thought process in order to allow me to get the big picture, going from the detail, which is left side of the brain, to the big picture, which is the right side of the brain, to then come up with the plan of addressing, having first insight into what's really going on for this individual, as well as how am I going to put those pieces together. So this was one of the very first things that I started doing back in 2008 to really help me understand what was going on for that child, especially as it relates to Moro. And Moro, third item, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So the chronicity of a heightened stress response was connecting that dot for me. And it was quantifying what I was able to see in the primitive reflex, but then also give it some quantitative analysis so that I would have even greater insight on how to address it. So now what I've done for the podcast audience is I have moved up to the second page of the report. So even though we were looking at the big global picture, it was the data coming from leads on top of the head, as well as different types of leads on the hands to measure heart rate, skin conduction, temperature, as well as a respiration belt to measure breathing, and leads on the back in order to measure muscle tone. So each of those are broken down into the report, but it's going to be based on how the brain responds. So at the top of this report, there's the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And then there are 4 brain waves identified. Going from left to right, it says theta, alpha, SMR, and beta. I'm going to start with beta. Now, you see colored bars. There's 4 different colors. Actually, we'll go ahead and include recovery. So there's 5 colors. 4 really bright colors. And then the gray bar is going to identify what's going on during recovery when the eyes are closed. So what's supposed to happen? Beta, representing our frontal lobe, is literally going to handle the stress. And as I indicated, there's 4 stressors. The first one is all about how's the individual adapting. Now, that colored bar is kind of a lighter blue. And so every light blue on the report is connected to that bar representing the beta brainwave on the brain. Okay? So the first one is about adaptation. The second one is a cognitive challenge. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the actual stressors because you might want to come in and have your child take the test, and I don't want you to make the child test smart. And maybe you want to get the test, and I don't want to make you test smart. So I'll just give you the categories. The second one is the neon green, and that's a cognitive challenge. Then there's royal blue, and that has to do with sound. And then there is hot pink, and that has to do with the breath. And then in between each of those colors is a gray bar. So the stress comes on, the brain responds. The stress is removed, and now the person closes their eyes and go into recovery. The stress comes on, beta should handle that stress. The stress is removed, close your eyes, and now we measure that by the gray bar. So now what should happen is like a picket fence. In beta, all those colored bars representing the brain handling the stress, they should be higher than the gray bar, meaning that the brain was handling the stress and engaging correctly. And in this particular situation, the first thing that pops out is that absolutely did not happen during the second stress, which is the cognitive challenge. It got a little bit better with sound, and it was the inverse relationship for the breath. But the one that really pops out is the cognitive. Now, the other 3, theta is your subconscious mind, your creativity. It is the dominant brainwave of children. And alpha is focus calm. SMR is sensory motor rhythm. All 3 of those should be the exact opposite of beta, meaning they should not be on when the brain is trying to handle stress, whatever that stress may be. So, excuse me. So what we should see all the gray bars as high as possible. And in fact, theta should be about 10 to 15% larger than alpha, but alpha's gray bars should really go over theta, because when you close your eyes with the intention of keeping them closed, alpha goes way up. Then when we look at SMR, we should still see the gray bars higher than the colored bars. So big picture idea with this particular map is we don't see a clear picket fence in each of those brainwave categories. So that means that the child's brain is having trouble engaging as expected. So that picket fence, color bars higher in beta, theta, alpha, SMR, gray bars higher, creating this picket fence appearance, would equal engagement, the brain knowing how to handle whatever's going on. In doing this since 2008, it really doesn't matter the label. It doesn't matter if we're talking about autism, attention deficit, hyperactivity or not, dyslexia, oppositional defiance, progressive developmental delay, OCD. It doesn't matter. That has been the number one thing that I could see consistently in every one of the stress response evaluations, that these children, their brain was not engaging as expected. That's a big deal. That means that we have found a common factor in all of these different types of labels. And that, from a clinical perspective, that is really how I feel. It doesn't matter if you're autistic. It doesn't matter if you have an attention issue. It doesn't matter if you're dyslexic. There's a common theme, and it's going back to how your brain is functioning. So the rest of the report shows us heart rate variability, heart rate, skin conduction, temperature. Now, for the podcast audience, I'm going to highlight this temperature one for just a minute. In comparison to its neighbor, skin conduction, at least, whether it's a colored bar or a gray bar, there are little barbells on each of the colored bars. And we want some kind of a response headed into that barbell. So looking at skin conduction, big picture idea, when it came to sound, that really made him sweat, because that's what skin conduction means. When I compare it over here to temperature, not one of those colored bars ever made it to the barbell. That is why temperature was over 4 standard deviations away from what's expected. If we look above, okay, so what was it for heart rate? Every one of the colored bars is outside of the barbell, but there's also almost this flat line across, meaning there's very little flexibility in the heart rate during that stress response, which literally helps us understand that there's a very given threshold for this little person. And boy, when he gets to that threshold, it's kind of like a metronome. Click, click, click. This is the level. This is the best he can do. But once he goes outside of that level, his bucket's going to tip. We already saw the differences for the right side of the brain, and it's going to become an emotional cascade. So this is the value behind looking at quantitative analysis. It gives me a picture inside somebody that I can't necessarily see for myself. I can literally see how stress is impacting the physiology of this little person. Wow, right? There's just so much to this. So that's just a little bit about looking at a stress response. It's important that we really understand that there's a physiological impact as well as a brain impact every single time we have stress. And I think sometimes people really use that word very freely, but they don't understand that if you walk around telling yourself, yeah, I'm stressed out, I'm stressed out, I'm stressed out, well, you're literally telling your brain to be stressed. So as we go into a new year, depending upon when you're listening to this, we're headed into a new year. And I think it's time for each and every one of us to start really taking better care of ourselves, taking a look at how we are functioning. Because as parents, you have a magnificent job and you are the number one role model for your child. What are you role modeling? And, look at your child. If you believe your child is really having a hard time or it's just in your gut, reach out. There's so many little ways that you could dip your toe in to Connect My Brain and learn so much more about us and how we can help. And we are here for you. So you can always send a request for information through the website, connectmybrain.com. You can ask to, hey, could we jump on the phone and have a conversation? Absolutely. Go ahead and send me the days and times that you're available so that we can get this scheduled as quickly as possible. Now, as I was telling you in previous podcasts, again, depending upon when you're listening to this, we were having some phone issues, but we are back up, which I am so grateful, especially to our IT person, Alex. He is terrific. So the office number is 678-501-5172. Please feel free to reach out. Again, thanks to my podcast manager, Marcy Page. This is our first year together, and I'm so excited about going into the next year together because together we're able to bring you guys just lots of great information. All right, well, I bid you adieu. I hope you have a beautiful Christmas season, and I hope you're getting ready and making a commitment to yourself, your family, your children, your life, that it's going to be the best one ever. God bless you.